Barack Obama thought he was stepping into another routine town hall, until a last-minute call from Ibrahim Traoré left him speechless and in tears on live television. The lights inside the auditorium were sharp, almost surgical, the kind of brightness that made every twitch, every blink, every half-second of hesitation visible to the rows of attendees and the hundreds of thousands streaming the event online. Barack Obama stood behind the curtain at the Long Center for the Performing Arts in Austin, Texas, lightly tapping his wedding ring against the edge of a note card in his hand. He always did that before going on stage. A small habit, barely noticeable, but rhythmic, familiar. He'd done 1,000 of these. Conversations about democracy, youth engagement, climate, justice, the balance of power. Some were stiff, others more human, depending on the crowd. Today's event was supposed to be one of the easy ones. A town hall format with college students and young professionals, diverse, sharp, idealistic. Austin's energy usually guaranteed a warm reception, a few good laughs, and maybe even a dance reference if someone pushed him. His team had already tested the mic levels, confirmed the order of pre-screened questions, and double-checked his talking points. Nothing surprising, nothing heavy. But then, just 3 minutes before his scheduled walk onto the stage, his assistant June rushed toward him, phone in hand, her expression unreadable. "It's someone from Burkina Faso," she whispered. "Says it's urgent. He asked for you by name." Obama raised his eyebrows, not because of the country, he knew it well, but because he wasn't expecting any call at all, let alone from West Africa. "Who is it?" he asked, taking the phone. He said, "Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional leader." That gave Obama pause. He knew the name. Traoré had made headlines in recent months, especially after assuming leadership during a military transition. Some praised his courage in the face of regional instability. Others were skeptical, waiting to see if he'd follow through on democratic promises. But one thing was certain: the world wasn't sure what to make of him yet. Obama didn't have time to ask more questions. The earpiece buzzed, stage manager counting down. "Mr. President, 2 minutes." He walked to a quiet corner backstage, pressed the phone to his ear, and spoke. "Hello, this is Barack Obama." The voice on the other end was calm, deep, and articulate. No fluff, no protocol. "Mr. President, I know this is unexpected, but I had to speak to you directly, just for a minute." Obama blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity. "Captain Traoré," he said slowly, "this really isn't the best moment, but go ahead." There was a short silence. "I wanted to say thank you. You won't remember me. I was just a boy in Ouagadougou. I used to read by candlelight when the power cut out. One night, I found a French copy of your book in a box at a market, The Audacity of Hope. I read it front to back. I didn't understand everything then, but I understood this: dignity matters." Obama felt a shift in his chest. The sound of 1,000 chairs being adjusted behind the curtain reminded him he had 60 seconds left. Traoré continued, his voice unwavering. "You wrote, 'Change won't come if we wait for some other person or some other time.' I took that personally. I believed you. I don't agree with everything you did, but you gave me something I didn't know I needed." Obama didn't know what to say. He looked down at the note card in his hand, talking points about economic partnerships and regional cooperation. They suddenly felt so small. "I'm leading my country now," Traoré said, "and it terrifies me. But I wanted you to know you helped me get here. I owe you that truth." Obama finally spoke, but softly. "Thank you for calling, Captain. That means more than I can say." They said their goodbyes. The call ended. The phone was handed back to June. Obama didn't move for several seconds. He looked at the floor, took a breath, then without a word, he walked toward the light. But something had shifted, and the audience was about to see it. The applause was warm, predictable, even affectionate, exactly what his team expected. But when Barack Obama stepped onto the stage, something was missing. not from the crowd, but from him. He greeted the audience with a quick smile, waved, adjusted the mic stand. His voice still carried that familiar calm, but those who knew him, really knew him, would have noticed a slight delay in how he responded to the moderator's first question. A pause not caused by hesitation, but distraction. His mind wasn't on Texas anymore. It was still back there, by the curtain, with that voice from West Africa. What struck him most about the call wasn't the compliment, or the reference to his book, or even the weight of knowing he had unknowingly influenced a foreign head of state. It was the tone. Traoré didn't sound like a man reciting talking points. He sounded like someone who had waited years to say something, and who didn't know if he'd ever get another chance. Obama continued the conversation on stage like a pro, fielding questions about youth movements, diplomacy, economic gaps. He cracked a joke about TikTok, nodded to the local mayor sitting in the front row, and even leaned back in his chair during a question about African infrastructure investment, pretending to catch his breath like it was a hard one. But the words from Traoré looped in his mind. Dignity matters. I believed you, and it terrifies me. That last part, that's what hit him the hardest, because it was honest, raw, and it mirrored something he had never really admitted out loud during his own presidency. Being in charge, truly in charge, is terrifying. Obama had spent 8 years balancing diplomacy, public pressure, secret briefings, and a world that never stopped demanding more. And yet, here was a man halfway across the globe who, with no script, just confessed what so few leaders ever do. That power doesn't come with certainty. It comes with weight, and sometimes unbearable silence. The moderator, an energetic 34-year-old political science professor from San Antonio, pivoted to a question about U.S.-Africa relations. President Obama, she said, if you were still in office today, what would your first move be with the next generation of African leaders? Obama's gaze softened. He stared into the lights, then back at the professor. He opened his mouth, but no answer came. Not right away. The crowd chuckled lightly, thinking he was being dramatic for effect. But the silence stretched 1 second too long. 2 seconds. 3. Obama lowered the mic slightly and looked toward the wings of the stage. Can I take a short break? He asked quietly, almost as if asking permission. There was no script for that moment. The moderator, startled, nodded. Of course, she said, unsure what was happening. He stood up, gently placed the mic down on the seat, and exited the stage. It took only a few seconds for whispers to fill the room. Backstage, June was waiting with a towel and a bottle of water, thinking he might be feeling lightheaded or tired. Instead, she found him hunched forward, elbows on knees, staring at the ground like a man trying to catch a thought that kept slipping away. Do you want me to clear the rest of the event? She asked quietly. He didn't answer, not immediately. Instead, he said something she hadn't heard him say in years. I remember being 26, broke, trying to organize South Side neighborhoods nobody cared about. I had nothing but a clipboard and a belief that maybe things could get better. June said nothing. She let him talk. That kid in Burkina Faso, reading by candlelight? I know him. I was him. And now he's out there trying to hold a country together, with people questioning him every hour, wondering if he'll sell out, waiting for him to fail. Obama exhaled. It wasn't dramatic, just tired. That's a lonely place. June didn't interrupt. She just handed him the towel. He wiped his face, nodded silently, and after another breath, stood up. Back on stage, the crowd waited. Some looked down at their phones, others watched the side curtain. A few local reporters were already typing blurbs about what might have happened. When he returned, the room quieted instantly. Obama didn't sit this time. He walked to the center of the stage and stood still for a few seconds. No paper, no mic stand, just his voice. I want to tell you something, he said, looking out into the audience. I just spoke with a young leader from Burkina Faso. He said he read my book as a kid, said it gave him hope, and now he's carrying a nation on his back. A murmur spread across the room. I'm sharing this because we often don't get to see what happens when our words go out into the world. We don't always know who's listening or where that echo lands. But what happened next would make that echo louder than anyone expected. Halfway across the world, while most of Austin was still trying to process what Obama had just shared, a man in a simple military uniform sat in a concrete-walled office in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. No flags behind him, no advisors, just a dim desk lamp, a half-finished cup of ginger tea, and the aftertaste of a conversation he never imagined he'd have. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't look like a man who had just shaken a former U.S. president to his core. He looked like someone carrying a weight he hadn't quite grown into yet, but was trying to anyway. He turned his phone face down, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. Then, slowly, his eyes drifted to the worn-out paperback resting beside his tea. The corners were bent, the spine cracked, and the pages inside were smudged with years of weather and use. A French translation of The Audacity of Hope. He could still remember the exact night he found it. He was 14, maybe 15. The electricity had gone out again, as it often did during that time, and his uncle had told him to stop complaining and go find something to do. He ended up at a makeshift market lit by kerosene lamps. There, buried between stacks of secondhand clothes and cassette tapes, he saw a box of books, all in various states of decay. Most were technical manuals or old French novels, but one caught his eye. The cover had a face he didn't recognize, but the title felt like something personal, something whispered, not shouted. Hope wasn't a word people used much where he grew up. He remembered reading the book with a flashlight he had to shake every 10 minutes to keep alive. It took him 2 weeks to finish it. He didn't understand every word. He barely understood half the politics. But the tone, the rhythm, the moments when Obama wrote not as a politician, but as a man trying to keep a promise to himself, those stayed with him. One line in particular had lived in his head for years. I am not opposed to all wars. I'm opposed to dumb wars. To young Ibrahim, it wasn't just about foreign policy. It was about being honest with yourself, about choosing battles that meant something. He didn't become a soldier because of the book. Life in Burkina Faso rarely allowed for that kind of luxury. But the book stayed with him, even during training, even during nights in the northern region when he saw things no one should see, even during the chaos of the transition when everything seemed to fall apart and the last thing on anyone's mind was hope. He didn't think Obama would answer the call. He thought maybe he'd get a polite assistant or a diplomatic brush-off. But something made him call anyway. I just wanted him to know I wasn't trying to be him, Traoré muttered now, alone in his office. Just trying to do right. He picked up the book again, ran his fingers over the damaged cover, and flipped to a page he'd underlined long ago with the edge of a torn matchbox. The arc of history bends in the direction of justice, but only when people grab it and pull. Back in Texas, Obama was still on stage, still standing. Imagine being a teenager in a place where people don't know if tomorrow's meal will happen, where leadership often looks like survival, not service. Oh, he said, his voice steady now. Then finding a book in a language you barely speak and somehow deciding that dignity is worth pursuing. The crowd listened without phones, without noise. Some of them leaned forward in their seats, unconsciously holding their breath. Obama glanced down at the floor, then back up. That's not a story about me, he added. That's a story about choice, about how we choose to lead, even when no one's looking, even when the odds are stacked. In Ouagadougou, Traoré's phone lit up again. This time, it wasn't a global call. It was his press secretary asking if he had seen the clip, asking if he was prepared for what would come next. He wasn't, not really. He knew the world would start digging into his background. They'd look for inconsistencies, for proof that he was either a hero or a fraud. But he also knew that this wasn't about him anymore. It was about the kid who would one day find a different book in a different box, in a different city. A kid who might read one line that changes the entire direction of their life. But not everyone believed the story was genuine, and the backlash was already brewing. The room was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for applause or commentary. Obama had just shared the story of a man who once read his book by flashlight and now led a nation through chaos. You could feel the weight of it. But what broke through more than anything was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, Obama wasn't talking like a former president. He was talking like a man who'd just been reminded of who he used to be. But there was one sentence in that call with Ibrahim Traoré that stuck with him more than the rest. The moderator had resumed the town hall, trying to gently steer things back on course. But when someone in the audience asked, "What keeps you up at night, sir?" Obama didn't dodge. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't use a quote or story to cushion the truth. He said, "Sometimes I wonder if I did enough." That wasn't on any script. It wasn't on any of the prep documents his team had reviewed. And it wasn't a rhetorical flourish to impress a crowd. His voice cracked slightly when he said it, and for the second time that afternoon, he went off script. "When Traoré told me he read my book by candlelight," Obama said slowly, "I was honored. But when he told me that being in power terrified him, that's what stayed with me." He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. Some leaned forward, others sat back. No one moved. He said, "I believed you. I believe what you wrote." And then he said, "But now I'm here, and I don't know how to carry that hope without letting people down." That's what did it. That's what broke something open in Obama. Because he'd been there, not just as president, but as a younger man standing in rooms where everyone expected him to be someone bigger, wiser, stronger than he really felt. Rooms where you don't have the luxury of saying, "I'm scared." Where people treat your every word like scripture, and yet you lie awake at night knowing you're just guessing. Every day, just guessing. Backstage, a camera operator whispered to another, "He's different today." A White House correspondent sitting 3 rows back began typing frantically. She'd covered Obama for a decade and couldn't recall seeing him this exposed. Meanwhile, across social media, the live stream was being clipped and passed around like wildfire. The phrase, "I wonder if I did enough," was already trending. Back on stage, Obama continued, "You carry that kind of faith someone places in you, someone you've never met. And you think, God, what if I got it wrong? What if I planted a seed that's growing into something too big to handle?" He didn't need to mention the wars, or the critics, or the places where people felt he fell short. The room was already doing that math silently. He ran a hand down his face, took a breath. There's something painful about knowing your words shape someone's journey, but you didn't stay long enough to help them build what comes next. It wasn't self-pity, it wasn't ego, it was grief. A strange kind of grief. Not for power loss, but for people left behind in the wake of it. In Burkina Faso, Traoré watched the clip on a small tablet. He was seated with 2 aides, neither of whom knew what to say. The footage didn't show a global icon. It showed a man wrestling with a legacy too large to carry alone. And even though Traoré had initiated the moment, it didn't feel like he was the center of it anymore. It felt like the conversation had cracked something open on both sides of the ocean. He turned to one of his aides and said, "I wasn't trying to make him emotional. I needed him to know he wasn't forgotten." The aide nodded but said nothing. In Texas, as the segment wrapped, the moderator cleared her throat and thanked Obama for his vulnerability and perspective. But it was clear the conversation had gone somewhere no one expected. The lights dimmed slightly as the audience shifted in their seats, unsure whether to applaud or stay quiet. Obama leaned toward the mic again. "I'm telling you all this because I think we forget. We forget how loud one voice can be, not because it shouts, but because it lands in the silence someone's been carrying for years." But while one half of the world listened with quiet respect, the other half began to question the entire moment. By the time the next segment of the town hall resumed, the air in the auditorium had shifted. It wasn't just the weight of what had been said. It was the awareness that something real had happened, something nobody could have rehearsed or prepared for. People in the audience didn't check their phones anymore. They weren't looking for sound bites or selfie moments. They were watching a man they thought they already understood, and realizing they didn't. Barack Obama sat forward in his chair now, hands clasped between his knees. He wasn't leaning back, smiling, doing that confident chin lift he'd perfected on campaign trails. No, his posture had changed. He looked like someone who wasn't quite finished speaking, even though the official questions had moved on. The moderator noticed it too. She looked down at her notes, hesitated, then closed her folder altogether. "Would you like to continue with the next audience question?" she asked gently. "Or do you need a minute?" Obama nodded once, then leaned into the microphone. "I'm okay," he said, "but I want to answer that last one differently." The previous question had been about influence, specifically how a public figure deals with being held responsible for the actions or beliefs of people they've never met, people who claim to follow their ideals. Earlier, he'd given a polished answer about accountability and how ideas evolve once they leave the speaker's mouth. But now, he took a different approach. "Earlier in my career," he said, "I thought my job was to create a message strong enough to carry itself, something rooted in principle, something that could live beyond the moment. And I still believe in that. But I think I underestimated how much of the message stays tied to the messenger." He paused. The room stayed silent. "When I wrote The Audacity of Hope, I wrote it like a man trying to explain himself, not to the world, but to his younger self. I didn't expect it to travel where it did. I didn't expect a kid in Burkina Faso to take it into his heart and make it part of his foundation." His voice steadied. "And now that kid is leading a nation. Which means, whether I asked for it or not, my words are walking with him." That sentence landed hard. Some people in the audience looked stunned. Others wore a kind of quiet understanding on their faces, because in their own ways they'd felt that too. Teachers, parents, coaches, anyone who'd ever said something offhanded, only to find out years later that it had changed someone's life. Obama leaned back slightly, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "I don't think we fully grasp the responsibility we carry when someone looks at us and decides to believe in something just because we believed in it first." He didn't name Traoré again. He didn't need to. What had started as a town hall about policy and youth involvement had now shifted into something closer to a confessional, and not just his. By this point, you could tell people in the audience were revisiting their own choices, the things they'd said to others, the examples they'd set without realizing. Backstage, the production team kept their distance. No one was whispering through headsets, no one was suggesting cuts or trying to steer things back on track. The event was no longer about control. It was about letting a moment finish on its own terms. Meanwhile, on social media, opinions were hardening. Some praised Obama's openness as a rare look into the emotional toll of leadership. Others accused him of theatrics, of using the story to center himself during a politically sensitive moment. A few questioned whether Traoré's call even happened in the way Obama described. "I don't buy it," one comment read under a viral clip. "Too convenient, too perfect, probably arranged." Another chimed in, "Real leaders don't cry on stage, they lead." But then came the responses from West African activists, diaspora communities, and African American scholars. A woman from Oakland wrote, "You think it's performative? Try growing up in a place where no one thinks your life matters. Then find a book that says maybe it does. You'll cry too." And underneath that, a comment from a young Burkina Faso engineer living in Cincinnati simply said, "That book saved my life, twice." In the auditorium, a young man stood up during the next Q&A segment. He was maybe 22 with a shaved head and a faded green hoodie. "My dad never really liked politics," he said. "But he made me read your book when I turned 16. Said it was the only time he ever heard someone talk about power without sounding drunk off it." The crowd laughed softly. The young man continued, "Just wanted to say, you helped my dad believe we could be something more than the mess he grew up in. So, thanks." Obama smiled. Not the polished smile, the other one, the quiet, small one that only shows up when he's actually trying not to cry. But while the room in Austin was finding healing, the headlines outside were sharpening their teeth. By the time the event hit its final hour, the camera angles had grown tighter. No more wide shots of the crowd, no panning across smiling faces. The production crew instinctively focused on Obama, his expressions, his hands, even the way he paused between thoughts. Something about the room demanded intimacy now. Distance wouldn't do. The moderator, sensing it too, stepped aside. The floor belonged to him, and everyone seemed to know it. Obama stood again, not for a speech this time, but almost as if standing might help him gather the pieces of what he was feeling. The silence inside the hall felt heavy but kind, like everyone was holding their breath together. "I didn't plan to tell this story today," he said quietly, "and I don't know if I even have the right words for it yet. But I think silence can be dangerous when it pretends to be strength." He exhaled through his nose. You could hear it in the mic, just air but filled with memory. "When I got that call, when I heard Traoré say he read my book in the dark and chose to believe in something better, something just came loose in me." His fingers trembled slightly, not enough to shake the podium, but enough for anyone watching closely to notice. "Because when you're president," he said, "people assume you don't feel things deeply, that you're trained out of it. But that's a lie. You just learn to hide it better." A pause. No one stirred. "And then someone reminds you that your words traveled farther than your body ever could, that they sat with someone through war, through hunger, through the night." He didn't wipe the tears when they came. He let them fall, 2, maybe 3, slowly, with the kind of stillness that felt less like weakness and more like remembering something you'd tried to bury for years. The cameras caught everything. Obama placed his hands flat on the podium and said one last thing before taking a long pause. He said, "I believed you. And I realized I still want to be someone worth believing." A gasp moved through the audience, not loud, but audible. Because in that moment, you weren't looking at a former head of state. You were looking at a man trying to measure the distance between who he was and who he'd hoped to be. One person stood, then another. The applause wasn't thunderous. It wasn't explosive. It was slow, almost unsure. But it built, second by second, until the room was on its feet. Not out of fanfare, but something closer to reverence. In the back row, a woman clutched her notebook to her chest. A middle-aged man pulled his glasses off and wiped his eyes with the edge of his sleeve. No one looked away. Outside the auditorium, reactions were already spilling over into every corner of the internet. News anchors were split. One said, "It's powerful to see someone who carried the world's weight for 8 years still visibly shaken by one story." Another added, "Or maybe it's just performance. He's got a foundation to promote after all." Conservative outlets picked up on the tears quickly. The headlines were sharp. Obama breaks down in public over call from African leader. Some suggested it was orchestrated to gain sympathy or revive waning political influence. But others pushed back hard. Activists, authors, and even former political opponents weighed in. Jasper Langdon, a Republican speechwriter from Ohio, posted, "I don't always agree with him, but today, that didn't feel like theater. That felt like a man confronting the limits of his own legacy, and that's something every leader should do at least once." Meanwhile, in a modest cafe in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré sat watching the clip on a cracked laptop screen with a few soldiers and journalists. No press conference, no national statement, just him nodding slowly as the video played. When the tears came on screen, one of his aides leaned in and asked, "Did you expect this?" Traoré shook his head. "No, I just wanted to say thank you." Then he added, "But I think I said more than I realized." He closed the laptop and looked out the window where children were playing soccer on a dirt lot, their laughter rising through the open shutters. Back in Texas, Obama was still on stage, finishing the town hall. "I don't know what kind of leader Traoré will become," he said, "but I do know this. Sometimes the people we try to reach end up reaching us, and that's not weakness. That's the whole point." But just as the room reached a quiet sense of resolution, the outside world wasn't ready to let go so easily. By the next morning, every major news outlet across the U.S. had run a segment or article about the unexpected moment in Austin. Some used the word emotional, others unprecedented. A few didn't try to explain it at all, opting instead to let the clip speak for itself. But the one thing no one could deny was that something real had happened, and it wasn't going away quietly. Cable news ran split screens, Obama wiping tears on one side, a stock image of Ibrahim Traoré on the other. Most viewers hadn't heard of him before. Now, his name was being discussed in political panels, Twitter threads, and college classrooms. And not just in terms of African geopolitics, but in terms of influence, vulnerability, and legacy. In a studio in Minneapolis, an NPR host asked her guest, a historian of African leadership movements, whether this moment would be remembered as a cultural turning point or a flash in the pan. The guest replied, "If a man like Traoré read The Audacity of Hope under a flashlight and carried that belief all the way to leadership, then this moment didn't just begin yesterday. It began years ago. We're just catching up." Meanwhile, Obama was already back in Washington. No follow-up press statement, no interviews, just a quiet return home. But those closest to him noticed he wasn't letting the moment pass like so many others before. Late that night, he sat alone in his home office, rewatching the live stream on his tablet. He fast-forwarded past the applause, the moderator's transitions, and the laughter. He paused at the part where his voice cracked. He didn't flinch watching it. He just leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes fixed on the version of himself who was still trying to make peace with the idea that words matter more than we ever prepare for. Then he clicked pause. The screen froze on the phrase he'd said without planning. "I still want to be someone worth believing." That line wasn't written in any speech. And yet, in the hours that followed the event, it had already been quoted in op-eds, blog posts, and even printed on T-shirts being sold by grassroots organizers from Los Angeles to Baltimore. But back in Burkina Faso, the impact looked different. At a university in Bobo Dioulasso, a group of students gathered outside the administration building, not to protest but to discuss. A few had pulled up videos of Obama's town hall on their phones, and one of them, a young woman named Helene with braided red yarn tied around her wrist, stood up and said, "If our leaders cried like this, maybe we'd trust them more." Her words made others pause. In the local press, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated Traoré's influence on the moment. Others questioned why he was speaking to an American president when his own country faced internal tension. A few accused him of seeking validation abroad instead of addressing issues at home. But Traoré didn't respond to any of them. He spent the evening writing something that wouldn't be released to the press, a handwritten letter, no official letterhead, no translation, no digital version. In French, he wrote, "You once said hope is not blind optimism, that it's the belief that things can be better if we're willing to work for it. I'm learning now that hope also means knowing you may fail, and still trying anyway." He folded the letter and placed it inside a notebook that had been with him since his days as a junior officer. Then he asked an aide to send it discreetly to Obama's foundation. Back in Washington, Obama met privately with his former chief of staff, now a university president. Over coffee, they spoke not of the town hall itself, but what it brought up. "You always knew your words had weight," his friend said, "but maybe now it's hitting you how far they traveled without you." Obama nodded. "I think I forgot that the people listening aren't always in the room." The friend smiled. "And sometimes they remember what you say better than you do." That line made Obama chuckle, but then he turned serious. What do you do when your words give someone courage, and then they come to you, scared, asking what to do next? His friend was quiet for a moment, then replied, "You don't give them answers. You remind them that being scared means they're still human, and that's the only kind of leader worth trusting." But while some people leaned into the story for connection, others still believed there had to be something beneath the surface, something calculated or even dangerous. By the time the sun rose over Washington the following day, the moment had already mutated. What started as a heartfelt exchange between two unlikely figures, one a former U.S. president, the other a transitional leader thousands of miles away, had been dragged through every filter imaginable. By then, the footage had been clipped, memed, slowed down, and dissected. What had once been a man holding back tears was now a lightning rod for every type of opinion the internet could offer. It didn't take long for conspiracy forums to twist the moment into something else entirely. This wasn't a spontaneous call, one user posted beneath a trending video. Obama's people planned it. Look at how he paused, clearly waiting for a cue. Another thread claimed it was a distraction. Whenever the global elite want to pivot attention from something real, they manufacture emotion. Some pushed darker narratives. They questioned Traoré's motives. Why call now? Why call him? One headline read, "Burkina Faso's young leader triggers global sympathy, but who is he really?" That's how fast it moved. Podcasts picked it up within hours. In one of the most shared episodes that week, a political analyst half joked, "You mean to tell me this man read The Audacity of Hope by candlelight, and now he's in power? Feels like the origin story of a character someone in Hollywood would have made up." But it wasn't Hollywood, and it wasn't fake. Still, when things go viral, people stop listening to context. They start looking for the twist, the crack in the surface, the piece that doesn't quite fit. And yet, for every cynical post, there were 10 more that didn't just believe the moment, they felt it. On TikTok, a librarian from Detroit filmed herself crying after watching the clip. "This isn't about politics, Pio," she said. "It's about what happens when someone sees the people who've been listening in silence." That call, that moment, that was real. A father in El Paso posted a video with his teenage son holding up his own worn copy of The Audacity of Hope. "I read this when I was deployed. Never thought I'd see my kid read it. And now he is. Say what you want about the man, but that's something." Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré's office was buzzing, but not with celebration. The mood was cautious. The moment had gone global, but so had the scrutiny. His communications advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Florence, laid her phone flat on the desk and looked him straight in the eye. "People want to know who you are now, not just here, everywhere." He nodded. Florence added, "They're digging into your past, your military decisions, even your family. We need to be ready." Traoré rubbed his forehead. "I didn't cry," he said quietly. "And yet, somehow, I'm being treated like I did." Florence didn't smile. "That's because you touched something people didn't expect from you." "Or maybe," he replied, "I reminded them that we're all learning this as we go." In the U.S., the cable news frenzy showed no signs of slowing down. One popular panel show ran back-to-back segments arguing whether Obama had exposed a weakness or demonstrated strength. "I don't buy into the emotional stuff," one commentator scoffed. "That moment was crafted to manipulate. You think a guy like Obama doesn't control every second of his image?" Another countered, "We spend years asking politicians to be honest. Then when one finally is, we call it fake. Make up your mind." And buried in all the noise, something else was happening, something quieter. Bookstores across the country began seeing a spike in requests for Obama's book, not from scholars or political junkies, but from younger readers, kids, college freshmen, people who weren't even old enough to vote when Obama left office. One bookstore in Tempe, Arizona posted a sign that read, "Yes, we have the Audacity of Hope, and yes, you can read it by candlelight if you want." It got over 300,000 likes, but perhaps the most unexpected ripple came from a high school senior in Tallahassee who posted a video saying, "I've never cried during anything political, but when he said, 'I still want to be someone worth believing,' I lost it, because I feel that way too, all the time." She ended her post with a single sentence. Maybe leadership isn't about power. Maybe it's about remembering the people who were listening when you didn't even know they were there. But in a world moving this fast, even the most honest moments can be buried under doubt, unless someone chooses to carry them forward. 3 days after the town hall, the chaos around the moment had quieted, but the meaning hadn't disappeared. Not for the people still talking about it in schools, homes, and cafes, and not for the two men who, without ever having met in person, had found themselves connected by a conversation that neither could have scripted. Barack Obama was in his study that morning. It was early, earlier than usual. The house was quiet, no phones ringing, no headlines flashing across the TV, just him, a cup of black coffee, and a stack of old journals he hadn't touched in years. He opened one at random. Inside were handwritten notes from his 2006 book tour, hotel names, notes from town halls in Cincinnati and Fresno. A list of questions someone once asked him. What do you do when you don't feel like a leader, but people still follow you? He smiled to himself. Then, as he flipped to the back of the journal, a small folded envelope fell out. Not recent, not postmarked, just a scrap with an address in Ghana someone had given him on a campaign stop. And that's when he made the decision. He pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer, clicked a pen, and began to write. He didn't draft it like a letter from a politician. He wrote it like a man answering a call he didn't expect, but now couldn't ignore. Captain Traoré, leadership doesn't come with a manual. It comes with silence, and then decisions that make the silence even heavier. But the fact that you called, that you reached out in the middle of carrying a whole country on your back, tells me everything I need to know. He paused, then continued. You're not supposed to have it all figured out. None of us did. But you cared enough to question yourself. That's rare. That's what makes you dangerous in the best possible way. Keep asking hard questions. Keep listening more than you speak. And never forget that fear is not your enemy. It's the proof you're not numb. He signed it simply, Barack. He folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and handed it to his assistant with instructions to deliver it through a secure diplomatic channel. Not flashy, not public, just human. Thousands of miles away in Ouagadougou, Traoré was doing something similar. He had spent the last 2 nights sleeping badly. The weight of international attention was unlike anything he'd felt before. Not even the pressures of the military transition compared to the global spotlight now sitting on his shoulders. But that morning, he called for the press secretary and made a quiet request. No speech, he said, just a visit. The location he had in mind wasn't one the cameras would have picked. It was a modest school on the southern edge of the city where he'd once volunteered during a break in his training. They didn't know he was coming. When he arrived, he found the headmaster in the courtyard, surprised but composed. I just want to talk to the kids, Traoré said. He walked into a classroom filled with teenagers, no cameras, just the sound of desks shifting and pencils dropping when the students realized who had walked in. He smiled and asked, "Do any of you know who Barack Obama is?" A few hands went up. One boy mentioned the Nobel Prize. A girl said, "He wrote a book." Traoré chuckled. "He wrote 2, he said, but one of them, it changed something in me." He sat on the edge of a desk, casual, approachable. "When I was your age, I thought leaders were supposed to be perfect. Now I know, they just have to be honest." He didn't stay long, maybe 15 minutes, but before he left, he pulled something from his coat pocket. A copy of the Audacity of Hope. His copy, worn, water-stained, held together with tape. He placed it on the teacher's desk. "Let them read it," he said. "All of them." That night, he returned to the presidential compound, and found the letter from Obama waiting for him. He read it once, then again, then a third time. He didn't frame it. He didn't file it. He folded it gently and placed it inside the same notebook where he'd once underlined the sentence about bending the arc of history. It stayed there, pressed between pages full of his own thoughts and fears. Two men, two continents. One message passed between them without cameras or podiums. A reminder that leadership isn't a title. It's a choice you make every time you tell the truth when it's easier not to. But while the exchange between them had ended quietly, its meaning had only started to ripple outward into places they might never see. Days turned into weeks, and the noise that once surrounded the moment began to quiet. Not because it was forgotten, but because the people who truly heard it didn't need to keep talking. They were already carrying it forward. In a small town outside Flagstaff, Arizona, a history teacher named Darlene Langford printed out the transcript of Obama's town hall and handed it to her 11th grade class. "Read this tonight," she told them. "Not for the facts, for the feeling. Ask yourself what kind of leader you want to become, even if no one's watching." In a suburb of Des Moines, a pastor rewrote his Sunday message around one sentence: "I still want to be someone worth believing." His congregation didn't all agree politically, but they listened that morning. Because the line wasn't about politics. It was about the private weight of being someone others look up to, whether you're ready for it or not. Meanwhile, in Washington, Obama went about his schedule. Quietly, deliberately. He declined interviews, avoided follow-ups. He didn't try to explain what happened. He knew if you have to explain a genuine moment too many times, people stop believing it was genuine. But in private circles, during dinners with friends, talks with young organizers, he brought it up, not to highlight his emotions, but to ask one question: what does legacy look like if it's not about recognition? Nobody answered it the same way. Some said it was policy. Others said it was reputation. One person, a retired nurse from Maryland, replied over dinner, "It's the things you do that show up in someone else's story later, even if they never mention your name." That line stuck with him. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré kept working. The pressure didn't fade just because he'd had a moment of honesty. If anything, the microscope grew sharper. His government made tough calls. Some praised, others criticized. But one thing shifted in the way he carried himself. He stopped trying to sound like someone who had all the answers. He started listening more, speaking less. He launched a reading initiative in 10 rural regions, nothing flashy, just books, chairs, and trained volunteers. He named it Light in the Dark, but didn't attach his name to it. When asked why, he said, "Because I didn't write the book that lit the candle." People talked. Some said he'd changed. Others said he was softening. But the ones closest to him knew the truth. He was growing. One evening, he was asked in an interview how he defined leadership now. He paused, then said, "It's the quiet decisions, the ones no one applauds you for, the ones you make in the dark, hoping someone somewhere will feel it." He smiled faintly, like reading a book by candlelight. That line, too, would circulate. It didn't trend the way Obama's words had, but it reached the people it was meant for. The story between these two men, so different in background, geography, and history, never became a film or a best-selling memoir. It wasn't dramatized in docuseries or turned into a global initiative. And yet, it lived. It lived in classrooms, in conversations, in letters, in the quiet reflections of those who realize that influence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. And only later do you realize how loud that whisper really was. Legacy isn't always about what you leave behind. Sometimes it's about who picks up what you dropped without being told to. So if you're someone wondering whether your words matter or whether your choices ripple out beyond your circle, remember this. A young man read a book under the flicker of a dying flashlight. Years later, he called the man who wrote it. And that man cried, not because he was weak, but because he was reminded that in a world obsessed with power, Sometimes the most radical thing you can be is honest. If you're watching this, ask yourself, who's listening to your voice, even when you don't realize it? What are they hearing? And when they carry your words into their future, will you still be someone worth believing? If this story meant something to you, take a second to share it. Someone out there may need to hear it more than you know. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because there are more stories like this waiting to be told.